Good morning. Isn't it good to be in the house of the Lord worshiping together this morning? It is good. We will be continuing our time in Jonah. And if you want to get there ahead of time, we'll continue in chapter 1. For those of you that don't have a Bible, there should be a pew Bible right in front of you. And it's a small book, so it may take a while to find, or you can just go to page 774 in those pew Bibles, and that'll help you find it right away. Before we get into that, many of you may not know that Martin Luther, the great reformer, the one that essentially we remember as stood up to the Catholic Church in areas where he felt the Catholic Church went beyond Scripture, he originally was studying law. He was studying law and he was at law school. He had already gotten 1 degree and he was continuing that on. And during his time of studying, he was going to take a trip to go back and see his family. A short trip, then go back to law school and continue his time there. Well, on that trip, he got caught in a significant thunderstorm. Significant thunderstorm where he thought, I may not make it to my destination. He was in a pretty big bind. Obviously, at that point, they didn't have vehicles like our cars that can make it through rain and thunderstorms. So he is traveling out in the elements. And he prays, but he prays to Saint Anne, which is the patron saint for miners, which was his father's profession. So it would have been the patron saint that he knew the best. And this is all within the Catholic Church because that is where he grew up. So he prayed and he said, if you save me, Saint Anne, I will become a monk, changing his profession completely. Now, the rest of the story goes that he was saved from that storm. He made it to his destination, and he followed through on that commitment that he had made. Instead of studying law, he became a monk. Now, he credits this to St. Anne, but we know that this was God working because St. Anne has no power to do anything. So it was God that used this storm to kind of change his trajectory. It was during his time as a monk, once again, kind of getting further into the Catholic Church, becoming a leader at that point, where he became very concerned of his sin, knowing that his sin is what separated him from going to heaven. And if there was any sin that lost the grace that he would have had, and he's thinking, every time I sin, it needs to be confessed, or I'm not gonna go to heaven, or I'm gonna go to purgatory for a period, and who knows how long that will be. So it was this point where he had an immense burden that his sin was significant. It was so immense that he would go to confession for 4 to 5 hours at a time, thinking of every last sin, making sure everything was confessed, and this was a regular occurrence for him. You can imagine the priest that was there saying, oh no, Martin Luther is coming again. This is a 4 to 5 hour conversation where he's confessing everything just because it was such a burden on him. It was this understanding of sin as he was reading through the Bible where grace started jumping off the pages of God's word. And he started to understand that it's not dependent on me to obtain salvation. God freely gives grace. So what started with a storm and changed someone's trajectory in life, brought them to being a monk, helped them to understand that the scriptures say God's grace is significant and we don't rely on ourselves. It was life-changing, all starting with a storm. We're going to see the same idea in our passage today. Specifically, we think about Jonah as we think of the book of Jonah. But today is going to be a little bit more focused, as we see in our passage, on the sailors that were present with Jonah. And we're going to see God's grace to the unbelieving. The one true God uses this storm to reveal himself to those sailors. Walking through this passage, we're going to look at them processing the storm and what it means and how someone offended God. We're going to see as they know and understand someone offended God that they move forward and say, how do we appease this God so that we survive? And then we're going to close with looking at the sailors experiencing God's grace. Foreigners, not even Hebrews, not even what would have been considered the people of God allowing to experience his grace. We're going to be in Jonah chapter 1, reading verses 7 through 16 this morning. And I would encourage you, if you are able, to stand with me for the reading of God's word today. Once again, Jonah chapter 1, starting in verse 7 and reading through verse 16. God's word says this. And they said to one another, this is the sailors, "Come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, "Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation, and where do you come from? What is your country, and of what people are you?" And he said to them, "I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, "What is this that you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he had told them. Then they said to him, "What shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us?" For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. He said to them, "Pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you, for I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you." Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, "O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you." So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. You may be seated. Let's pray that God would guide us through this passage as we look at God's grace to the unbelieving. Let's pray. God, we thank you for your grace. Your grace being unmerited favor, meaning you look down upon us and you give us what we do not deserve. We are sinners, as we are going to see this morning. We have offended you with our sin, and yet you still show us your grace. God, encourage our hearts this morning with that truth. God, convict our hearts to be burdened with our sin and be seeking your grace. Guide us through our passage this morning, I pray. In Jesus Christ's name, amen. If we remember back to last week, we saw that the sailors understood this is not a normal storm. This is not normal. This is something significant. It has come up, kind of popped up out of nowhere. They know this has been caused by some other power. So they start searching to say, which God did this? Who offended one of the gods? They saw this as a God retaliating to one of their actions. So verses 7 through 10 in our passage this morning is an investigation process where they're trying to figure out who offended God. They simply want to deal with whatever business has been brought up through this storm because their end goal is found at the end of verse 6, where it says, perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish. They just want to live. They just want to survive. So they're figuring out who offended a God. The first thing that we see kind of in their investigation process was they were allowing God to show the way, allowing God to direct. And we see in our passage that they're relying on some higher power. The sailors at this point aren't sure who that is, but they say, if we've offended one of the gods, let's put it in the hands of the gods to tell us who that is. So they cast lots. Casting lots would have been a very common occurrence to say, we want to be doing what the gods or what the one true God, if you're an Israelite and a Hebrew, what are they telling us to do? Now, in a situation like this on the ship, we don't exactly know how casting of lots took place, but it could have been something like this: taking two dice that have black and white sides on top, painted on each of the edges. And then they roll them, and it could have been two whites pop up, and you know, okay, this person is okay. They have not offended the gods. And then it could have been rolled for someone else, and maybe it comes to Jonah's turn, and it's two blacks come up. And they say, okay, you have something. This has something to do with you. We don't know exactly for sure what. And then maybe it was a white and black, and they need to re-roll to figure it out. But what they're doing is they're saying, we want to put this in the hands of whoever we have offended to tell us what we should do next. It was understood even among God's chosen people, the Hebrews, that God worked through the casting of lots. Proverbs 16:33 says this: the lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord. Saying even as we cast lots, we are saying this is God's will. So they are saying this is the way God speaks to us in certain situations. It was a way of allowing God to show his will with whatever they had questions about. A significant example of this taking place in the New Testament would have been in Acts chapter 1, verses 24 through 26. This is where the apostles are trying to replace Judas, who had hung himself, and they wanted to have the 12 apostles. So the passage says this: and they prayed and said, you, Lord, who know the hearts of all, show which one of these two you have chosen to take place in this ministry and apostleship, which Judas has turned aside to go to his own place. And they cast lots for them, and the lot fell on Matthias, and he was numbered with the 11 apostles. They took this as God's will. They had two men that would have been good. They would have been qualified. The people saw these as leaders, and they're like, God, we want you to choose which one should fill that 12th spot that has been opened. So we see that also taking place in our story with Jonah. Figuring out who offended God, let us cast lots to see. Well, you see in our passage, they did cast lots, and it fell to Jonah, and their immediate reaction was really to ask Jonah, okay, something with you is you're at the center of this. We don't exactly know what, we don't exactly know why, so they start asking him questions. In a sense, they go and they're trying to affirm the results. And saying, let's ask some questions, let's figure this out. The die has been cast, you have come up. Let's figure out if this is true. Is Jonah going to be able to affirm that he is the offender? That's what they want to know. They ask him 4 questions as they try to get through this dilemma and try to affirm what they are assuming the God that has been offended is telling them. They ask about his occupation, his hometown, his origin, and his heritage. Notice they don't ask about his God. Now it's interesting because you would have thought, man, that's going to be the first thing that they ask because they're concerned. Is a God offended? Is that why this is happening? Is it your God? Now, the reason they wouldn't have asked that, because all of these questions leading up to this would have pointed to exactly what God Jonah worshiped. Because everything was very associated with where you grew up, very cultural. That's why you have a lot of various religion. It was a lot of practices that they went through and saying, where are you from? Where's your hometown? Where's your land? If you tell us those things, we can decipher who your God is. We can figure that out. So they ask questions leading to this answer of who is your God, to see if that is the God that has been offended with these 4 questions. Jonah cuts right to the chase, gets right to what is most important to him, and his response actually skips the first few questions and jumps right to the last questions that they asked, his heritage, when he said, I am a Hebrew. That is my background. I am a Hebrew, and he continues in saying, I fear Yahweh. In our Bible, it says it has the Lord in all capitals, but that's using God's formal name, Yahweh. It would have deciphered God from any other of the gods that the men on the ship would have worshiped. They would have known, I've heard of that God. I know of him. That is the God of the Hebrews. Jonah continues by saying this isn't just a local deity that has a little jurisdiction over the country or the land. He says this is the God of heaven. This is an elevation in saying this is the God above all other gods. Not only is he the God of heaven, but he is the God that has created the sea and the land. You think about the sailor's perspective at this point, and they're thinking, oh no. We have this stranger, this foreigner we do not know. He's not a part of the crew. We just picked him up because he wanted passage from one land to another. We have the storm that's come up, and now we have this, the lots have been cast. They come to this man, and he worships the God over land and sea. It's starting to settle in that, yes, the results have been affirmed. Jonah is the offender. It's at this point that Jonah, you can kind of get a glimpse from him. He realizes punishment is coming. I'm being figured out. I can't hide any longer in the bottom of the ship among the cargo sleeping. I can't be on the edge just trying to run away from God. My plan is being found out. Punishment is coming. He no longer could try to evade God. He was trying to go in the opposite direction, and even in going in the opposite direction, God still stopped him in his tracks. The sailors are starting to understand this storm was not caused by a local deity, but rather by the supreme God, the one true God, the true Yahweh who has significant power. On one hand, they're extremely afraid. You see that in their response. What have you done to us? On the other hand, there's frustration in saying you knowingly are running away from this God, your God. And yet you chose to come on this ship. You were putting all of us in danger, endangering all of our lives. We see that in this passage, Jonah confesses to them his whole scheme and plan. Verse 10 says, for the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he had told them. The one who offended God has come clean before all of them. They know the whole plan. They know what's taking place. It's been affirmed. Jonah is the one that has offended God. Running away. Maybe even telling them the whole story. Like, I'm supposed to go here, but I'm running away this direction here. They're at a hard point. Things are probably even worse than they thought. What are they going to do now? What are they left with? That brings us to a second main point that we have this morning, is the point of appeasing God. They found out who was offending God. Now you see them changing their course now that they know what's going on, and their direction is, how do we appease this God? Because we just don't want to die. Verses 11 through 15 are an attempt for the crew to seek out what is the best way to appease this God and the wrath that he is showing on us through the storm. It's interesting going forward, you're going to see these men don't just say, a God. There's specific language that you could use to say gods or one of the gods, but they use God's formal name. They start identifying and talking about Yahweh just like Jonah does. We'll see that popping up throughout the rest of the passage as they seek to appease Yahweh that has been offended by the sins of Jonah. The first thing they're trying to do is figure out, what do we do next? Figuring out what is the steps and what are the actions that we are to be taking. How are we supposed to appease this God named Yahweh so they can accomplish their goal of not perishing? The very first thing they do is they turn to Jonah, the one that has offended God, and say, you know him. You've offended him. What do you say we should do? They're trying to figure that out. Their goal is just to make things better, to have the sea calm. All the while, it seems like things are just continuing to get worse for them. Jonah's response, throw me overboard. Throw me overboard, and I know I am the cause of this. So if you throw me overboard, I know the sea will be calm and you will be saved. Jonah is essentially saying this: let the sea finish what it has started. God has brought punishment through the sea, and the sea should finish me off. I turned from God, and my sin is deserving of death. That is the picture of the sea. Death, punishment for the sins that Jonah had committed. This turning, or this talking to the sailors, this admission of what they should do, is essentially an understanding of Romans 6:23 before Romans 6:23 has ever been written, where it says, for the wages of sin is death. The wages of sin is death. Jonah has sinned against God, and he knows he does not deserve life. You stop at this point in kind of the whole story. Now again, we're only in chapter 1. Let's pretend we don't know the rest of the story. This is ironic. This is significant. A prophet of God who was supposed to go to a foreign nation, condemn them of their evil, and tell them judgment is coming, runs away from God, is condemned of his evil, and essentially is told judgment is coming. Throw him overboard. The men now have a choice. How are they going to respond? Jonah has given his solution and saying, this is what needs to take place. What are they going to do? Their first instinct is, let's not make things worse. Let's not make things any worse. We're already in a really bad situation. So you think about it from the sailor's point of view, they have a massive storm caused because a man sinned against Yahweh, the high God of heaven. And they're thinking, what if Jonah, or they could be thinking, I don't know exactly what they're thinking, but they could be thinking, what if Jonah's wrong? What's going to happen if we throw this guy overboard? And that's not the real solution. Is that God going to be mad at us? Are we all going to perish? Is our ship going to get torn to pieces and we are all going to die? We see a hesitancy on their part to not follow through with what Jonah told them he needed them to do to make things calm again. So what do they choose to do? Let's take things into our own hands. If this God was offended by Jonah because he's going the wrong way and he got on this ship, let's just take him to land. Let's find the nearest land, drop him off. God can do whatever he wants with him. So they start to row harder, our text says. They start to row harder, trying to get to land, but the storm just gets worse. They see this as hopeless. Our actions are kind of worthless. We're in a worse situation now because we've tried to take it into our own hands. Their plan is not working. They get to the point where they are literally at their end. Everything as humans that they could possibly come up with, they've tried to do, and the problems are still there. Their solutions have run out. They have no other option than to take the advice of Jonah. They prepare to throw him overboard. Even before that preparation, we see a prayer that they give to Yahweh, the high God of heaven. They ask that their lives be spared. They would not be held accountable for the death of Jonah. And they end their prayer with this phrase, "You have done as it pleased you." They're starting to realize that this storm was really caused by God. He had a purpose and a plan behind it because someone offended him, and the only way to appease him in his anger and wrath is to put this person overboard. You have done as it pleased you. They can't undo what Jonah has done. They can't go in the past and take him off the ship. They can't even row to land to try to get him on the nearest land that there is to say, God, do what you want. You have done as it pleased you. In an attempt to stop the storm and to not make things worse, they do hurl Jonah overboard and are shocked with what happens next. What we're going to see happening next is God showing his grace to these sailors. We'll look at Jonah next week. Right now, the story kind of stops with him. He is cut off. All we know is he's over the edge. And then the focus gets put on these sailors and their experience of God's grace. The first way that they experience his grace is that the storm stopped and they did not perish. God saved the men. He saved the sailors that were there. He showed them his grace. The sea was raging. There was punishment for Jonah. They could have been kind of swept up in it too, and casualties of Jonah's sin, but rather God saved them. This is the prayer that the men have been praying. Please do not let us perish. God answered that prayer. The calming of the storm was that answer. The calming of the storm was also a condemnation of Jonah. It was that affirmation that he was the guilty party. As soon as he was thrown overboard, just as he said he should be, the waves and the storm ceased. It showed that the villain of the narrative is no longer on the ship. The ship is no longer in danger. The men did not perish. That was their whole desire. A second way that the men experienced God's grace is through the way God made himself known even to foreigners. God made himself known. They were going about their business. They're in this shipping industry. They're just taking goods from one place to another. They're trading. Obviously, they have this whole pantheon of gods, even among the ship, saying, hey, everyone pray to your own God. We got to figure out what's going on. When God made himself known, even through a difficult situation with Jonah. They saw Yahweh have the power to bring up a storm. They saw Yahweh have the power to calm it immediately. They saw the power of God. Verse 16 is significant in this passage, and I want to read it for us now. It says, then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. Now it's interesting to look at the timing of this. They had known from Jonah that it was most likely Yahweh was the one that was kind of offended and frustrated and bringing judgment through the sea. They knew that earlier, but they didn't, like Martin Luther, in the midst of the storm, make promises saying, if you just deliver us, we will follow you. This takes place after everything is calm. They've seen the power. And after it's all calm, they're not making deals with God, but rather they have a worship of God afterwards. They feared the Lord, offered sacrifice, and made vows. This is worship of this God, Yahweh, whom now they see the power that he has. We don't know if the men abandoned all other gods, the ones that they worshiped and maybe were crying out to earlier in the storm, but we know that they've been exposed to the one true God, Yahweh. They've seen his power firsthand, and at least at this point, we see them worshiping him. That's God's grace. Before the storm, they may not have had any clue because they're on the sea all the time. They may have had certain passengers at certain times, but we don't know. But now there's no doubt they've been exposed to the one true God. God made himself known, and they responded to him. So this is good and all. And we can see some exciting things about that, but we have to ask ourselves, why do we care about this today? Is it just something that's a good story that we can tell our kids one day and grandkids? This is what God has done? I would challenge us and say we also have to have a response. We also have to look at this and say, what is God teaching us through this? The first thing that we have to see is that we too, just like Jonah, have offended God. We've offended God. Every one of us. It doesn't matter who we are. We are just like Jonah. God tells us this is the way you are to live. And we're like, that's hard. How about, God, I go this way? I think my way is a little bit better. This should be our motivation for helping and serving other people. And you're like, they're difficult. How about I let someone else do that? I'll just go and do this. And God tells us in his word, this is not to be a part of your life. And you're like, man, the world makes that look so good. Maybe I'll just try a little bit. And we get sucked into sin. Every single one of us have offended God. Now, for some of us, we may be more like Jonah. We know who God is. We have a relationship with him. And there are times that we just choose to go the opposite direction. When it's exposed to us, we're like, yes, I know I have offended God. Now, there may be other times that we're more like the sailors, or there may be people in here that are more like the sailors where they're like, it's out of ignorance. We do not know. Now, in this story, the sailors were not the ones that were the offenders. The punishment was not for them, but we know they worshiped other gods. They worshiped false gods. We know that they were sinners, and there was simply an ignorance for the one true God and what it means to offend him. So whether we know who God is, or whether we, in ignorance, are like, man, I'm just learning about this. I've not heard about this before. All of us have offended God. God's word makes this clear in Romans 3:23 when it says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. All have sinned. All have wronged God. All have gone against what he tells us is good and right. This is no small thing. This is Yahweh, the God of heaven, who controls the sea, who controls the land, who sustains all things and created all things. That is the God that we have offended. That should be significant to us. That should break our hearts to know that our sin goes against our Creator. This should drive us to be just like the sailors and seeking out, how do we appease God? What does that look like? We know we are sinners. We know that we're going to live a life separated from him. How do we fix this? That's where the problem comes. We can't. I can't. You can't. We aren't good enough to fix the problem. We don't have the strength to fix the problem. We don't have the power and authority to fix the problem. But we know the one who does. That's Jesus Christ. That's why he came to earth. That's the impact of his dying in our place. That's why we remember communion regularly. To be reminded that it was Jesus Christ's sacrifice for us in our place that paid the penalty for the sins that we have committed. We cannot appease God in our strength. We have to rely on the power and sacrifice of Jesus Christ in our place. As we think about this, 1 John 1:9 comes up and says, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. That is the power of Jesus Christ's sacrifice. We confess our sins. We come to him and say, God, we know we have offended you. We know we have done wrong. We also know we can't fix it, but we know the one who can, Jesus Christ. Confess our sins. He is faithful and just to forgive us our sins. This means we repent. This was Jonah in a sense, and we'll see it a little bit in his prayer coming up, but he admits, I am guilty. Throw me overboard. We at the same time need to say, I am guilty, and I need Jesus' payments for me. If that takes place, we get to receive the same exact blessing that the sailors received, in that we too can experience God's grace. We can experience God's grace just like the sailors, where they didn't deserve anything, but God gave that to to them. You can experience the grace of God and live your life with him as both your Lord and Savior. We can experience the grace of God. Whether it be his deliverance in a hard situation, his forgiveness of our sins once for all, or an ever-growing relationship with him. Think about that. The God of heaven who controls all things wants to be in relationship with us. He loves us. He wants to hear from us. He wants to speak to us through his word. That is God. That's God's grace. We don't deserve any of that, but he gives us an opportunity to be in relationship with him. This brings James 4, verses 8 through 10 to mind when it says this: draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched and mourn and weak. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. That is God's grace. We can experience that very grace. We're going to close our service with communion. So I would invite those that are going to be serving communion. You can make your way forward and take a seat at the front there. And I would invite Rachel to come up, and she's going to be leading us in a song. Communion is a great conclusion to this passage, because it is a remembrance of what God has done for us through Jesus Christ. We see that, and we're reminded by this that we have offended God, and it is his body that was given for us. It was his blood that was poured out for us, that's symbolized in the elements of communion that remind us that we have experienced God's grace. God, we are thankful for communion, the constant and regular reminder of the sacrifice that was given on our behalf, the constant and regular reminder of your grace for us. We did not deserve this, but we rejoice and come to you with thanksgiving because you chose out of your love to give it. Thank you for your grace to us. In Jesus' name, amen. May our response be the same as the sailors, and we go away worshiping because we know and have experienced the grace of God. Go in peace this morning.